Thank you, and welcome to this last panel of the first day of the conference. I'm Eva Nanopoulos. I'm at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the seminar series in contemporary Marxist theory, which is basically a collaboration between King's College London, various departments including European and International Studies, Geography and French, Loughborough University, and specifically the Institute of International Management, and also the Law Department, which is where I am at Queen Mary. So our two speakers this evening really need no introduction, David Harvey and Michael Roberts, and they need no introduction primarily because of the very rich contribution to the study of Marxism, and including the reading of Capital, and also because Michael Roberts this morning already has appeared under a different name. Tonight he'll be speaking under his own name. Before I invite them, however, to take the floor, I would also like to highlight that this particular session doubles as the opening of the European and International Studies seminar, and I would like to invite Professor Magnus Reiner, who is the head of department, to make a few remarks before we open the floor to the debate.
Thank you very much, Eva. As head of department, I cannot really think of a more pleasant thing to do. Certainly one of my more pleasant tasks this week is to introduce a panel with Michael Roberts and David Harvey. Spaces, and certainly that is the case for someone who has a degree from York University in Toronto. Anyway, spaces to conduct Marxist and critical theoretical analysis is, in my experience, and I have a few battle scars, tend to be precarious and ephemeral. And this is something that we very much try to counteract at our department at King's College, on the basis of particularly of a very, very successful MA in International Political Economy that Alex and Simona Talani started now several years ago. I certainly owe my own job from that MA. We have been able to, I think, gone quite far in creating spaces, particularly for younger and emerging scholars. And I think we have been able to make some great appointments over the last few years, and we hope to make some other ones. And we have started, I think, to create a very, very vibrant intellectual life for Marxist and critical theoretical debate and scholarship. A very, very important contribution there is the contemporary Marxist seminar series that we do with our colleagues around London. Another one is the more specific departmental modern Marxism series, which has been at the core of organizing this conference. And we have a whole range of different activities and debates and events ranging from more abstract and theoretical debates and conceptualizations to very much more concrete and immediately political issues such as the Eurozone crisis. For example, one of the things that the group has done they came out on one of the seminars is a special issue in Science and Society last year. Anyway, this is very much part of these initiatives, and I'm extremely pleased that this is turning out to be such a successful event, and it gives us confidence to go onwards and upwards. So the only thing I'm going to say is to everyone, happy conferencing. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's me to start. I thought what I would do is to try to build on some of the things that were said this morning, so we don't repeat, and try and add a few dimensions, because much of what was said I agreed with, except with Michael, of course, and we'll get into that, doubtless. One of the things that I've been working on is to try to get a sense of what Marx might have meant by the totality of capital. He uses that concept a few places in the Grundrisse. And it seemed to me it was important to start to look at what was going on in the different volumes of capital in relationship to the totality. And what's volume 1 do, what does volume 2 do, what does volume 3 do, what do the other theories of surplus value do, and so on. And in thinking this through, I thought I needed some sort of map of the totality, and I should have an idea of what kind of totality it was. For me, it's not an organic totality in the ordinary sense of organic, although Marx does use the organic metaphors very frequently in natural history metaphors. It's more like an evolving ecosystem in which divisions of labor are changing, new divisions of labor come in, drive out old, it's growing and developing and all the rest of it. And I wanted a way to somehow or other visualize the basis of this. And so, since we heard a lot this morning from Paul Matic about analogies, I thought I'd put up my analogy, which is the water cycle, the hydrological cycle. And the thing I liked about this analogy is that H2O takes different forms, or metamorphoses, as Marx says, of capital. I mean, here it's a liquid, there it's a vapor, and it comes down in all kinds of different forms. Some of it flows very fast down back into the sea, some of it gets taken up and gets locked up in glaciers and moves at a glacial pace. Some of it disappears underground and never seen again until human beings come on the scene and pump it out. So, and capital seemed to me to be pretty much like that. And that therefore I would try to set up a sort of something based on this, which would give me an idea of how capital circulates and how it accumulates. So if we could go to my version, and this is my version, which is nowhere near as enticing as the diagram, and I'm trying to find a way to make this much sexier than it really is. But anyway, maybe I can do this by standing up. This helps us, I think, understand what the circulation process is and how accumulation is occurring. And the best way to look at this is to say, well, okay, let's look at how money, which is there, gets converted into capital. Now, Marx makes clear that not all money is capital, but capital is money used in a certain way. So somebody takes some money somewhere, which means there's got to be a good monetary system in place before any of this can really start. The realization of value then takes place in the conversion of back into the money form. Now, the commodities are of three kinds: means of production, which come back in here. Some are luxuries, which go off, and some of it are wage goods, which come back to the reproduction of labor power. That money form, you can then start to think of it as being distributed. And here it is distributed over here, and it has many different forms. Some of it goes to the labor in the form of wages, and then flows back into effective demand, into the realization of value in money form. Some of it is taken in taxes. Now, one of the problems in three volumes of Capital is Marx has hardly anything to say about taxes. And this had everything to do, I think, with that outline we saw where Book 5 was going to be about the state. And Marx was always in the habit of saying, if I'm not ready to deal with it, I'm not going to deal with it. And I'm only ready to deal with it after I've done all my work on the state. And so he doesn't say this, but so we don't see much about taxes. But I had to put taxes in here because otherwise the whole system doesn't really make sense. The rest of the money gets distributed amongst various factions of capital. Some of it stays with the industrial capitalists, the people who've organized all of this production process over here. Some of it goes to the merchants, who often play a very specialized role in actually facilitating the realization of value in money form through markets. Some of it goes to the landlord class as rent, and some of it goes to the banks in the form of interest. And these forms of distribution then actually are sort of set up in a very, very particular kind of way. And then out of this, all of this money which is assembled here in these different forms, some of it flows back into consumption, final consumption, since the industrialists and the merchants and the landlords have to live and bankers have to live. Some of it is reinvested and flows back in through to this, which then comes back into the money capital. This is the circulation, the core circulation process that Marx describes in the 3 volumes of Capital. And I think you can see clearly there are 3 distinctive and I think very important moments in this. One is production, the second is realization, and the third is distribution. Now, there are a lot of contextual conditions under which this occurs. And in the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx draws attention to these contextual conditions. One of them is that labor power gets reproduced. And so there's a whole kind of question of how does labor power get reproduced. Marx says, well, obviously it has to get reproduced, and that's it, but I'm going to leave that to the working class to worry about that. Capital doesn't care how it gets reproduced. It just gives workers a salary and says, get on with it and reproduce yourselves, create families and all the rest of it. So Marx doesn't say much about social reproduction, but of course there's been a lot of work within the Marxist tradition over questions of social reproduction, family organization, reorganization, housework, and all of the rest of it that goes on here. Behind this, however, there exists what I call the free gifts of human nature. That is, the contextual situation that Marx is drawing upon imagines there's human beings with a certain species capacity, and therefore the growth of human capacities and powers historically is a very important basis for the way in which this system is going to work. These come into Capital as free gifts. The cultural capacities, the knowledge that is embedded within people who know how to do things, the know-how, the cultural preferences and all the rest of it. These conditions are terribly important, and they also play a role in terms of wants, needs, and desires. Now, wants, needs, and desires are very much in evidence in the economic and philosophic manuscripts and also in the Grundrisse. They are taken up very briefly in chapter 3 of volume 1 of Capital, but after that, Marx tends to leave all these questions about wants, needs, and desires alone. But you can see immediately that the dynamics of a capitalist system is going to be perpetually reshaping wants, needs, and desires. And if it didn't do that, it wouldn't last very long. So actually, the dynamics of what goes on with wants, needs, and desires is something terribly important, but Marx tends to leave that aside also. Similarly, we find down here free gifts of nature. We are talking here about the production, reproduction, and destruction of space, place, and nature, the creation of what Marx calls second nature in the form of cities, which have been, the value of which has been long ago amortized, and so on. So we get a world here where there's a lot of assumptions which Marx builds in by talking about the metabolic relation of this circulation process to the relation to nature. The production of second nature, how important it is in terms of built environments and environmental modifications which are being created. And if there is destruction going on here, then how much of that destruction is due to and attributable to what is going on within this circulation process. So the contextual conditions of this are frequently mentioned in Capital, but they're just mentioned. And when Marx mentions them, he always does it in a way which suggests he knows they're extremely important. But he just says, I'm not going to investigate these in any detail here. I am going to concentrate on capital. And capital to him is different from capitalism. And capital is about the theory of motion of, if you like, the engine inside of this ecosystem, the energy structures within this ecosystem. The details are left outside, and the contextual conditions are left outside. So this is how he sets things up in the 3 volumes of Capital. Now, the interesting thing when you do a visualization of this kind is it immediately makes you start to think of all sorts of questions you want to ask and all sorts of interesting things. And the first time I sort of drew this up, I looked at it and I said, oh, Jesus Christ, look, did you notice something? Volume 1 is about this. It just takes you from here to here. He kind of says, I assume everything exchanges at its value. There is no realization problem in volume 1. Everything is realized in volume 1 automatically. And you kind of go, actually, volume 1 is just one segment of this totality. And it's actually analyzed under certain assumptions. And it's very important to take the assumptions, because otherwise, what you do is you actually assume Marx is talking about a reality when he's talking about a set of conclusions that come from an analysis of a system which is understood as having certain limitations and certain assumptions built into it. And one of the assumptions in volume 1, which is crucial, is there is absolutely no problem of realization. Therefore, apart from chapter 3 of volume 1, there's no discussion of the question of wants, needs, and desires, and there's no question of effective demand, except he does say in the chapter on money, he kind of says, commodities are in love with money, but the course of true love never did run smooth. And so you then go on and talk a little bit about, how new divisions of labor come in and things that were once wanted, needed, and desired no longer are. So you get a little bit of that in chapter 3. But then after that, you forget the whole kind of question. Volume 2 is, in effect, about the realization of value. It's about more than that, because in volume 2, you do a run around of this whole circuit. He says, okay, what's the circulation of money capital look like when you go through this? What's the circulation of productive capital like when it goes through this? What's the circulation process of commodity capital? Or the whole circulation process? So you get a sort of description of this whole circulation process to start off volume 2. But then after that, you start looking at the problematics of realization. But this is then very peculiar that one of the things Marx does in volume 2 is to assume that there is no realization problem. So he wants to study realization problems by assuming there is none. Now this is, so in effect what he does is to move ass backwards by kind of saying, I assume everything is in equilibrium, and then I ask, actually, in order for it to be in equilibrium, what are the conditions which must prevail in society for that equilibrium to be achieved? And he there starts to talk about different turnover times. Somebody mentioned, you mentioned turnover times. Turnover times in volume 2 of Capital is fabulously worked through. And how do you coordinate a capitalist system when some articles are produced in a turnover time and a working period of say 6 weeks and some in 6 years? Well, how do you coordinate all of that? And how's it put together in a way that actually makes kind of smooth sense when actually you can see there's all these jagged edges and problems. And what you see also in volume 2 is Marx actually talking about turnover times and recognizing that the only way that these turnover times can really be coordinated is to actually go to volume 3 and use the credit system. But he says in volume 2, I leave all that to volume 3. So volume 2 is very frustrating because he does that kind of thing. The other thing which Marx does in volume 1 is to assume there's absolutely no problem of distribution. That is, Marx kind of says, look, I don't think I'm interested in volume 1 in talking about the way in which things get distributed between, rent and interest and merchant capital and all the rest of it. I'm assuming that those distributions don't have any effect. So volume 1 then assumes things about volume 2 and things about volume 3. So this is held constant and that is held constant while you examine in great detail what is going on in here. And we've heard some good descriptions about what goes on in there, and I imagine with this audience, most of you have read volume 1, and so you're very familiar with everything that goes on there. So I'm not going to actually give you a little talk about what goes on in volume 1. But what goes on in volume 1 is dependent upon these contingencies. For example, when you get to the general law of capital accumulation, what we see is that actually in volume 1, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That actually there is a way in which the polarization in society gets greater, and this is a great critique of Adam Smith's utopianism about the free market will actually bring you a society which is a benefit to all, and Marx kind of says a free market, what it does is actually put you in a situation where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, you can say that in volume 1 because there's no problem of realization. It's a contingent kind of statement about what's going to happen to the working class. But in volume 2, you find something else going on, particularly when you get to the reproduction schemas, that if the demand for wage goods is being forced down lower and lower and lower and lower, you're going to get a lot of disequilibrium in the realization side of things, and therefore there is a realization crisis which gets set up because of the processes which you're describing in volume 1. So volume 1 says you're going to get this result. Volume 2 starts to talk about what he calls rational consumption on the part of the workers, rational not from the standpoint of the workers, but rational from the standpoint of capital. That is, what is it that the workers are going to do and how they're going to consume, and what kind of worker consumption must be organized in order to keep the system in equilibrium. And you get a different story at the end of volume 2. And the volume 2 story says you've got to keep workers' consumption up. Because if you don't, then you're going to have no market and you're going to get a crisis. So that volume 1 tells one story, volume 2 tells another. Now, what's the true story of capital? My answer is that's the contradiction that capital is always working with. If it's doing a good job on volume 1, it's really screwing up in volume 2. If it's doing a good job in volume 2, as it did after 1945 through Keynesian management and all that kind of thing, you're screwing up in volume 1. And this is great, you see, because you kind of say, actually, these two volumes within the totality are telling different stories, but the stories are incompatible with each other, and these are actually exploring what Marx calls the contradictory unity between production and realization. And that contradictory unity between production and realization means you have to drop the assumption that somehow or other there's no problem of realization and all the commodities exchange at their value. You have then to actually release the whole kind of story from the constraints of Marx's assumptions. I have no objection to him making assumptions. I have objections to people who don't even notice he's making assumptions. So this is, to me, a kind of one of the important things to do. But as I've said, the questions that are raised in volume 2 are actually, to some degree, answered by the fact that you really need the credit system. And you need the credit system for a very, very simple reason. That if, for example, you've got fixed capital, and you've bought a machine for $1 million, and it's going to last you 10 years, and you take back $100,000 each year towards replacing it at the end of 10 years, then you're going to have to put $100,000 under the mattress almost every year. And Marx then kind of says, that's dead capital. And dead capital is anti-value. It's the end of capital. So you're destroying value by having to actually put it in the mattress. So you need to bring it out of the mattress. How do you bring it out of the mattress? Well, the credit system, the banking thing's there, so to bring it out of the mattress. And this is what, therefore, is absolutely crucial, that hoarding, which would be necessary to make the things work in terms of these differential turnover times, has to be reduced. Because Marx says excessive hoarding is going to be destructive to the dynamics of this system. In fact, we want to get those hoards out of there and get them back into flowing back in this system. They have to come back to function as money capital. This is what one of the credit system has to do. And that, therefore, links volume 2 with volume 3. Now, what you then start to see is relations of various kinds between the 3 volumes of Capital in terms of the totality. And my argument would be that you cannot understand what Marx is doing unless you're prepared to start to think about the relations between the 3 volumes of Capital in this totality kind of structure. Because if you miss that, then you're going to miss out on a whole set of, I think, extremely interesting and very important implications. For example, the question today came up about fictitious capital formation and what goes on. What goes on in this area of distribution? I mean, some of the money gets over here and it just gets lost, like in the hydrological cycle somewhere. Some of it gets locked up in glaciers and never comes out. Well, that can happen here too. And if that happens, then no longer is value in motion. So Marx kind of says capital, and I define it now, capital is value in motion. And it's defined as value in motion, but it's value in motion that is continuously increasing itself. It has to increase because you need to produce surplus value. Why do you need to produce surplus value? Because you need to get a profit. And that system, therefore, is continuously expansive. So you're imagining then this ecosystem which has this kind of character which is continually expanding. And it's expanding geographically, and it's expanding and intensifying, and it's growing. And it's growing at a 3% compound rate of growth a year. So we're not going to look at this as a simple cycle. And Hegel differentiated between what he called a bad infinity and a virtuous infinity. Simple reproduction is a virtuous infinity. And it's interesting, Marx has chapters in volume 1 and 2 of Capital about simple reproduction. I think he's fascinated by the idea of simple reproduction. And in volume 2, there's more about simple reproduction than there is about expanded reproduction. But simple reproduction is viable. Expanded reproduction in the long term is not. It's a bad infinity. And when you get to the bad side of the bad infinity, you're really in trouble. And we have a nice way of talking about this in the English language, which is, It's not a cycle, it's a spiral. And we have this phrase, things spiral out of control. On the streets of Baltimore, if somebody's having an acute drug episode, they say, man, I'm spiraling. And it means you've got to get them to hospital quickly. Capital is spiraling. It's spiraling out of control. How is it spiraling out of control then becomes the kind of big question. And when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, well, okay, where does the energy come from that powers this whole system? In the hydrological cycle, it's basically, you know, the sun sending radioactive, you know, it's energy from the sun. And you can mess around a bit with that, and it's not entirely, some of it is spiraling because of climate change and all that sort of thing. But here, turns out there are three bases for the drivers of this system. The first driver is, of course, individual money capitalists getting hold of some money, turning it into capital, and doing this volume 1 story. And that is a lot, and Marx, of course, you know, in volume 1, that's what you're thinking about all of the time. That's what's happening. You know, greedy capitalists, and sometimes they get forced in competition with each other. They get forced to do things. So there's a lot of energy then which comes from there. But the question then arises, suppose the money capitalist gets up to this point of realization and they can't realize the commodity. You get actually a very important point at the end of the very first section of Capital. Marx says, if there is no want, need, and desire for a commodity, then there is no value. So value is only produced here potentially, and it only becomes real when it is realized. And as Marx says, money says, you know, capital produces value in production, but value has to be realized in circulation. And it's that contradictory unity between production and realization that lies at the core of this circulation kind of process. But Marx has assumed away the realization problem in volume 1. We have to put it back in, and we have to start to talk about how wants, needs, and desires are managed in society. Because the management of wants, needs, and desires is a crucial part of capital's history. And if you can't manage wants, needs, and desires, you have no value. There is no value. There is a blockage. And here this comes back to what kind of theory of crisis do we have here? What, in effect, Marx says is the continuity of this system is absolutely essential. Furthermore, given the analysis of turnover times in volume 2 of Capital, it has to speed up. It has to move faster. It has to go quicker. So what's the history of capital been about? It's been about speed up. And you can't leave that aside. It's actually kind of an incredible part of capital's history. Speed up, going faster, faster, faster. And that then becomes also part of the whole kind of question of the management of wants, needs, and desires. And if you can't manage the wants, needs, and desires, there is no value. And in that point, it kind of says there's a potential for crisis formation, of crises of realization. We know about the crises of production because they're well established and understood in volume 1 and also to some degree in volume 3. But in volume 2, we still have to really face up to the possibility of realization crises. And those are significant. And even more than that, we actually have to find out that there are social struggles occurring around realization, because as somebody said this afternoon, actually where value is produced is not necessarily the same place as where it's realized. Value produced in China by Foxconn is realized by Apple in the United States. So the point of realization is completely different, and actually who realizes it is completely different. It's the merchant capitalist, which is Apple, that realizes it, and of course it's the Foxconn people who produce it. And the Financial Times tells me that the profit rate in Foxconn is 3%, and the profit rate of of Apple is 27%. So you can see, you were talking about transfers of value there. Here you go. There's a lot of transfer of value going on from one part of the world to another through exactly processes of this kind. So this is, I think, again, a very important thing that attaches to this history. If there is a real problem of demand there, what happens? Somebody has to create it. How is it created? Who creates it? Well, this is where the state apparatus comes in. And again, Marx doesn't use this very much. But this is where the state apparatus comes in terms of demand management. And it's not simply, that we have also specialists, like the madmen of advertising who make you want things even though you don't want them. It's not only that. It's actually the creation of a way of life which has implicit in it a certain set of wants, needs, and desires that you have to have in order to live. Does anybody in this audience not have a cell phone? Well, two people. Gee, wow, see? The rest of us have succumbed to wants, needs, and desires, which came over the last 15 years, and in order to live, we got to have a cell phone. Well, actually, after World War II, the United States had a real problem of demand management, so one of the things they did was they went out and they built the suburbs. And they built huge suburbs, and boy, did this create wants, needs, and desires. Everybody had to want, need, and desire, not only an automobile, but, they had to go out and mow their lawns every Sunday morning, so you had to have a lawnmower as well, and things like that. So, actually, the creation of a way of life, and this is what Marx talks about when he's talking about culture and civilization, that actually the creation of a culture and a civilization has everything to do with the creation of wants, needs, and desires. But then the interesting question, is it wants, needs, and desires that we really wanted? Or is it rational consumption from the standpoint of capital? And if it's rational consumption from the standpoint of capital, isn't there something alienating about that? Can we have alienated consumerism? Is there a real political problem here? Are there fights over wants, needs, and desires? And the answer is, you bet there is. Furthermore, there's real fights over realization of value. And therefore, there is a point of struggle here of a realization which has a different character from the point of struggle there. And this is where we get into some real kind of controversial questions. Because if there is class struggle, and we want to call class struggle in a very narrow sense that which attaches to the production, then what are we going to say about struggles that occur at the point of realization? These are often about the qualities of urban life. These are about things like the exploitation of people through escalating rents and property prices, through pharmaceutical drug prices and all the rest of it, which are kind of, and there's a lot of thievery and robbery that goes on at the point of realization, and capitalists are very adept at that thievery and robbery. I mean, when some hedge fund guy takes over a pharmaceutical company that manufactures a drug and sells at $7 a drug, and then puts it back on the market at $750 a pill, it's perfectly legal. There's nothing to stop it. And this is appropriation by dispossession. This is accumulation by dispossession. So you get a lot of accumulation going on at the point of realization, and a lot of political fights which go on here, and they're forms of struggle which are anti-capitalist, but they're, as Marx pointed out when he did mention these things, they're not actually class struggles in the classic sense. They are actually struggles between buyers and sellers. They have a different struggle, different structure. Take the pharmaceutical case. Whoever has that particular thing that needs that pill, they can be quite rich, and they're being screwed. They can be middle class, they can be working class, they can be, unemployed. So those fights have a completely different character. What's the relationship of those political fights which go on at the point of realization with production of commodities? Similarly, when you start to look at the free gifts of nature and the way in which cultures are being destroyed, fights over cultural destruction, who engages in those fights? And are they class struggles in the classical sense? No, the answer is they're not, but they're anti-capitalist struggles. So in other words, I'm beginning to suggest to you that when you look at this and you map class struggles, you map political and economic struggles all over this thing, you come up with the idea that either you've got to have a very, very, very broad definition of what class struggle means, and I'm okay with that, but it's struggle against the capitalist class, or you have to start to say these struggles are of different sorts and they have different kind of ways of forms of organizing. They have different meaning and there's a different dynamic involved in the struggles. Look at the struggles over the destruction of nature. Look at those. Now, are they class struggles or are they anti-capitalist struggles? And I want to talk anti-capitalist struggle and kind of say, look, there is a lot of evidence that a lot of the things you might want to deal with down here cannot be dealt with without actually seriously intervening in this whole kind of process. This whole kind of process is about growth. It's about cumulative growth. It's about compounding rates of interest and compounding growth. And compound growth, when Marx was writing, was really no problem, because capital at that time was only kind of located in one kind of small part of the world. Now it's pretty much everywhere. And it's so much everywhere, and all kinds of things are going on which environmentally are pretty catastrophic. And some of that environmental catastrophe is also associated with the fact that the expansion of this system is having blockages all over the place. And people have been talking about it today. Where are the blockages in this system? But the blockages are increasingly being overcome by actually manipulations that are occurring in the field of distribution. And this is the third point of energy, which in Marx's day he began to see in his chapters on money and all the rest of it, when he kind of says, actually the main lever of accumulation is the credit system. The driving force of further accumulation is the credit system. So Marx starts to see that actually there's another source of energy for this whole thing, which lies in here. And that's the formation of fictitious capital, and I know people have problems with that. But it's basically about the assembly of monetary funds here, which absolutely have to find an outlet, because they are obliged to. Give you an example, pension funds. Pension funds, a mass of money coming in here. They just can't sit on the money. They've got to find some way to launch it back into production. They've got to find some sucker down here who they can encourage to take on debt so that they can go through the system and they can get the 8% they want on their credit, on their pension fund. Now, therefore, there's a tremendous circulation of interest-bearing and fictitious capital, which starts to get mobilized in here through what I call the state-finance nexus, becoming absolutely critical to the management of this whole system. So this is, again, the visualization allows you to ask these kinds of questions, and when you look at it, you kind of say, okay, there are these three forms of struggle, which are three forms of energy which come into it. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which I can sort of take up here just to look at the dynamics of what's been happening. Okay, 5 minutes. Let me just go back to the question of value. Value is what is foundational for Marx when he says it takes different forms. There's a complicated relationship between money and value. Money is not value. Money is a representation and an expression of value. Marx is very clear about that. Very clear about that. But as a representation and an expression of value, it can lie. It can be erratic. It can be taken in other directions. In other words, there's a complicated relationship between value and money. And I think the relationship between money and value is not well understood. In the first volume of Capital, Marx talks about the contradictions in the monetary form in relationship to value. He mentions a couple that are very important. And I haven't got that much time to elaborate this, but one of them is that actually price and value are not only quantitatively incongruous in relationship to each other, incompatible, they're qualitatively so. And he says, conscience and honor can have a price, but they have no value. So does uncultivated land have a price, but no value. What kinds of things have a price and no value? We saw a great example this afternoon, with this whole kind of question of reputational value. It has a price, but no value. The goodwill, remember it? How much of a trading was about goodwill? And therefore, the relation between price and value is really a problematic one. And because of that, what we're beginning to see is that the monetary form has escaped, if you like, control. And it's escaped control because of a very significant event which some Chinese economists that I read say is one of the most important events in capital's history. And that is 15th of August, 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Because after that, there was no money commodity to discipline what was money. And given that there has to be a limitlessness to the accumulation of capital, the only form of capital that can actually accumulate without limit, and Marx says this several times in Volume 1 of Capital, is the money form. It can't be limitless with commodities. It can't be limitless in production. It can be limitless in terms of money. So since the 1970s, we've had a system where there is no material constraint on the monetary form, and therefore we can actually issue debt and we can do all these kinds of things. So what we've seen is an incredible increase in indebtedness, which has been mentioned. Maybe you can have the next graph just to show that. And this is the US indebtedness, all forms. And you see it in the 1970s, it was relatively low, and it just sort of takes off. And it has a hiccup in 2008-9, and then it kind of resumes its merry path on upwards. Actually, global indebtedness these days has become a huge, huge, huge kind of problem. If you try to translate that physically into something, you get something like this. Give me the next. You get the huge increase in indebtedness in a country like China. And China has not been mentioned. And by the way, that's one of the points I would want to make, that China is the largest economy in the capitalist world right now. And what the hell the rate of return is on capital in China, nobody can really measure or know. Let's go to the next one. This is the consumption of cement in China versus consumption of cement in the United States. This blue line at the bottom is the consumption of cement in the United States over 100 years. And as you know, because the United States has consumed a great deal of cement over the last 100 years, this is the consumption of cement in China. They're covering the whole goddamn country with cement. But you can see what they're doing, and they did it very fast, and this is one of the things I've got to mention to you. Everybody talks about the crisis here. In 2007, 2008, you know, China had 0 lines of high-speed rail network. Now they've got 15,000 miles. They built 15,000 miles of high-speed rail network in 10 years. That takes a lot of concrete. And when you're there, you get concrete all over the place, and now you can whiz around the country on high-speed trains at an incredible rate. This saved global capitalism. I mean, you were talking about revival of capitalism, what was going on in capitalism in Latin America. China's demand, give me the next slide. China's demand for steel, look at it. Look at the next one, which is copper. China's demand for copper. Any country producing raw materials during this period, since 2007, 2008, was essentially booming because commodity prices were high. And they were high because they were in the China trade. So anybody who was in China's orbit didn't have a real bad time after 2007, 2008. We think the crisis was global. You go to China and you see something completely different. And none of this nonsense about austerity politics and all that kind of stuff. This is a kind of expansionist kind of process. And the Chinese now have got immense surpluses, which they don't know what to do with. They've got surplus steel capacities. So what do? They start actually building the rest of the world. All over the place. Give me the next slide. And actually, what you suddenly see from this is that dashed line is foreign investment of the Chinese abroad. And it crosses the line of foreign investment into China in 2007, 2008. Very interesting year. And then all of a sudden, it soars off. Where does it go? Give us the next slide. This is the early patterns of trade in 2003. Give me the next one. These are the patterns of trade 5 years later. Give me the next one. This is foreign direct investment in 2003 from China around the world. Hardly any of it. Now give me 2013. This is what the Chinese are doing. This is a phenomenal phase of capitalist growth, which is China-centered. And we managed today, apart from one question, to avoid any discussion of what the hell's going on in China. But China actually has saved global capitalism, but in a very peculiar way. And we have to think about all of these kind of processes, and the debt financing, which has gone on in this, is crazy. So the Chinese now have their debt is 250% of their GDP. You know, back in 1970, when Mexico got to about 90% debt to GDP, it was considered a basket case and had to be disciplined by the IMF. Now the whole world is actually around 220% of GDP indebtedness. So this is where we're at, where it seems to me the capital is at right now. And we have to get away from actually imagining that what's happening to us is the significant thing that's going on in the world, because what China's doing is really the really significant thing. And we're getting all these crazy theories of a new phase of capitalism, like cognitive capitalism, because, you know, the Italians couldn't see themselves manufacturing anything, so they thought they might like to make value out of ideas. And then somebody comes along and said arts, and there's, you know, so the French come up with a crazy idea. There's reputational capitalism or something like that, which is okay for them. And you kind of say, you know, talk about the geography of the creation of Marxist theory. It's kind of very interesting. Go sit in China for a bit, and then you just tell a different tale. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, David Harvey, for a fascinating presentation. Now, moving on from the perspectives from the circulation of capital, we have the perspectives from the accumulation of capital from Michael Roberts.
Well, it's difficult to follow David, isn't it? A compelling and intriguing account of how we see the circulation of capital, how we can analyze capital from the way Marx did in volumes 1, 2, and 3, then on to the crisis contradiction points that David has expounded, not just in the production process, in fact, nothing was mentioned about the production process, but in the circulation and distribution process. So I want to go back to volume 1 and start again, perhaps with a slightly different approach, and remind ourselves that the most important driver, motive for capitalism is to accumulate, as David said, maybe in a spiral, but certainly to accumulate. And this is the classical aim, historical mission of the bourgeoisie, as Marx outlines in volume 1, chapter 4. But what is the level of abstraction? What is the motive driving, what is the real energy force, to use David's phrase, in the process of accumulation of capital? And as Marx says, the profit of the capitalist class has to exist before it can be distributed. So primarily, as in volume 1, but not only in volume 1, the question of developing and creating value and surplus value in particular is the driving force behind capitalist accumulation. I take this out of Fred Mosley's book, Money and Totality, which he outlines the point that from the point of view of Marxist theory, he looks at capital in general, the production of surplus value, the circulation of capital, and the relationship between profit and capital in general. The distribution process, competition and distribution, is really at a different level of abstraction. And do you notice one thing? Because in David's excitingly circular view of production, circulation, and distribution, there is no mention of one thing which is in volume 3, but is actually part of the process and the major contradiction between the creation of surplus value and at the same time to sustain that by maintaining surplus value. Namely, Marx's law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, 3 chapters in volume 3, which is not just about distribution. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall in those chapters is not about distribution. It is about the process of accumulation and the limits that capital faces in accumulating and developing surplus value. Now, the key thing about capitalism, as David has pointed out, is the massive accumulation of the means of production. Accumulate. Here's a figure which shows, going back, you can see with the development of industrial capitalism into the early 1800s and onwards, the massive increase in domestic capital formation. This is a quantitative development. But in Marx's Capital, volumes 1 and 3, particularly volume 1, in his general law of capital accumulation, he says, look, it's not just a quantitative thing, there's a qualitative thing going on. And the law of capitalist accumulation excludes every diminution of the exploitation of labor and every rise in the price of labor, which could seriously imperil the continued reproduction on an ever-larging scale of the capitalist relation. So in other words, the aim is to expand surplus value by using the accumulation and development of fixed capital and the means of production, and to reduce as much as possible that share of value that goes to labor. So the law, again, the law of capitalist accumulation, is that the accumulation of capital, though originally appearing in just a quantitative extension, is only affected under a progressive qualitative change in its composition, under a constant increase of its constant at the expense of its variable consistent. In other words, that the value will increasingly have to be in the hands of capital and the capitalists as against the production of that value by the variable constituent as far as capital is concerned, namely the labor force and the working class. Now, here we go, Michael Roberts' first array of graphs. And the first one here we see is the massive increase in the productivity of use values. This is from the work of Esteban Maito, and I'm going to explain what it means. It means that there's a huge increase in productivity, and at the same time, a huge increase in the volume of capital per person. So we have what we have in volume 1, an increase in what is called the technical composition of capital, the amount of volume of capital relative to people working in it, and the increase in productivity as a result. But the law of accumulation is also restricted and develops into the law of profitability, which is in volume 3, not just distribution, but the two things, the law of accumulation in volume 1 goes into the law of profitability. Displacing living labor from production depresses the average rate of profit, since only living productive wage labor creates surplus value, the social substance of profit, rent, and interest, which is the breakup and distribution in volume 3. So the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is offset by counteracting factors, but they can't entirely negate the law as such. So economic crises, which we've partly discussed, or David discussed, not really in the production process, but in, he said, in circulation and in distribution, economic crises create conditions for restoring profitability up to a point, but they also tend to become more acute. The secular trend of the rate of profit is downward, barring a massive slaughtering of capital values. And slaughtering capital values is the necessity that capital faces in order trying to restore profitability and continue the accumulation process further forward. So the fundamental issue is not a distribution of income. It's not in the distribution area, in my view, but in the insufficient production of surplus value. It's a quick account, 2 seconds, of Marx's law. The rate of profit is surplus value over constant capital and variable capital. And here's the trick. If we rephrase that formula, then we can see that the rate of profit depends on whether the rate of surplus value rises quicker than the organic composition of capital. ROP falls if the organic composition of capital rises faster than surplus value, the rate of surplus value. And the rate of the organic composition of capital will rise faster as a tendency. That's the point that Marx makes throughout Volume 1. The key point is that accumulation of capital takes the form of a rising organic composition of capital. But there are times when the rate of surplus value, when it rises fast enough, when workers' wages are repressed or the exploitation of the workforce through technical developments enables the rate of surplus value to rise faster than the organic composition of capital, the counter tendency. I think these two things are they are connected, but the point that Marx makes, and I think in Volume 3 he does, that the tendency will overcome the counter tendencies. So the main barrier is capital itself, and the disruption of reproduction takes place first and fundamentally and underlyingly within the process of the sphere of production. And I quote Paul's father here from 1974, where he points out, towards the end of this quote, the crisis characteristic of capital thus originates neither in production nor in circulation taken separately, but in the difficulties that arise from the tendency of the rate of profit to fall inherent in the accumulation and governed by the law of value. Now, the Bank of England has produced data for 3 centuries of economic indicators in the UK. This is available on the website. And the reason I'm going to use this is I want to map out the class struggle from the point of view of the law of accumulation and profitability. And we can start way back in 1855 here. This again is from the work of Esteban Maito, an Argentinian Marxist economist who languishes in the cellars of the Department of Finance of Argentina, which must be a tough experience, on very limited pay and without much acknowledgement, and therefore I'm able to usurp all his work and put it all for myself. And you can see that if we look at the black line, this is the United Kingdom. By the way, we're talking about only the United States has apparently got decent data. Well, lo and behold, the Bank of England has provided us with decent data. The UK's rate of profit from 1856 to 2009 is the black line. So the law of the tendency rate of profit to fall is actually achieved in this result. There is a long-term secular decline in profitability. The red line shows employment moving up and down. So continually, as the law of capitalist accumulation says in Volume 1, there's a creation of a reserve army to enable of labour to enable capitalism to accumulate. This then sometimes falls back and then it goes up again, but it's an up and down process, but there's always that reserve available. The green line shows how unemployment reacts to that situation and can therefore provide the conditions by which the rate of profit rises. We can see, particularly in the 1930s, how the unemployment rises sharply and with it eventually the rate of profit. And perhaps the most important line too is the blue line, which shows in fact the growth of constant capital, the accumulated capital as a whole, the net stock of capital throughout the UK economy, which particularly in the post-war period increased for quite significant amounts per year. These are growth rates. I'm told that it's not possible to measure the technical composition of capital. It's not possible to measure the organic composition of capital. Well, Esteban attempts to do that. We can see that the technical composition of capital, which is the increase of the volume of capital per person employed, the dotted line, TCC, historically over the whole period of the UK has been growing. Yes, what you get is a reduction in the prices of much of those fixed assets as we introduce new technology, reduces the value of labor time taken involved. So you can have, as you can see with the productivity, we get an increase on the thicker dotted line, is also up as the increase takes place. But then if we look at the value itself, the organic composition of capital itself is much lower, Y over K, as we see the expansion of that lesser line there because of the increase in productivity and therefore the reduction of labor time involved. But nevertheless, the maximum rate of profit, excluding the impact of anything to do with counteracting factors, which is the very thick black line, you can see has generally been down again. This is my own work, taking the figures of the Bank of England again, and I find that when Marx wrote Capital and published it in 1867, that's where the rate of profit was in the UK. In fact, it was rising. Interestingly, that suggests to me that it's no wonder that the 1857-58 crisis that we talked about in the first session only lasted a few months instead of bringing the whole of capitalism down. Capitalism wasn't such in a bad state, at least in the UK, at the height of the UK's hegemonic power in that period. But then we see a very significant fall in the rate of profit during what is now called the Long Depression, or the first depression of capitalism, down to the 1880s and forward, before we see, after a series of quite severe slumps, a pickup in the rate of profit through to the Second World War. Engels publishes the other volumes, which finally give us the idea of the law of the tendency rate of profit to fall. Nobody knew about this, really, until this period we see in the latter part of the 19th century. And then you can see in the period after the First World War in the UK, the very sharp fall in profitability, the post-war slump and the depression, eventually the defeat not only of the miners and the defeat of the general strike, but therefore creating conditions, interestingly, for British capital to improve its profitability, having crushed the labour movement, and take that up to the period of the Second World War, and a recovery and a post-war boom, which continued after the war with a much higher rate of profit than we'd seen probably since the early 1900s, according to this data. But what do we find after the 1960s? A massive fall in the rate of profit. That's been repeated across the board by all the major economies. There was a major fall in the rate of profit, and a national crisis developed. This is the period when, of course, David probably even younger than me, we were all running around as students because the revolution was about to happen and the national crisis was there with this massive falling rate of profit. And then we enter the neoliberal period in the UK from about the mid-1970s, and the rate of profit stabilizes. It's not much of a success, is it? The neoliberal period, it stops the huge fall, but it doesn't really create a new environment for a significant rate of profit that would lead to significant improvements in capital accumulation and growth. We can see the end of British hegemony very much with the balance of payments current account. We see through the second half of the 19th century that the UK dominated the world, just as David has described that China is increasingly doing so through a massive trade account, current account, and ability to export capital. But then we see the end of British hegemony after the First World War, the collapse of its current account surplus, and it's moving into a permanently deficit situation, which no doubt Brexit will accelerate over the next few years. British Labour during this period also took different periods. We have a period where in the 1880s and 1850s, growth in real wage growth was relatively good during the depressionary period, surprisingly, because capitalism was on its knees and those workers in work were able to maintain that position despite the depression. But we see the collapse after the Second World War in real wage growth, the recovery after the Second World War, and then the great boom that we see, inflationary boom to some extent, but this is real figures. The 10-year moving average shows the sharp increase in the post-war period, a unique period in the history of capital and labour, a unique period. It hasn't really been overcome yet. That's a unique period which has never been repeated in the history. But you see where British Labour's real wage growth is now. It's, according to the Bank of England, it's now the worst it's been in 166 years in the whole history of British capital, if you like. So I want to go and map the class struggle now. And here I'm getting into a bit of a dangerous area here, because I'm now going to be determinist, mechanical, monocausal. I think there was another one. All right, can't remember. Anyway, I'm going to take the idea of what's happening with profitability and link it to the health of the capitalist system, and therefore what the reaction of the labour movement in the UK has been since 1891, because I managed to get the strike figures back that far, and see what this tells us about what's going on with the class struggle. You see how I've just stuck to what I consider is the class struggle. That's the battle between the workers and capitalists over the control and of the surplus value and the value. The question of what's happening, whether I like a cell phone or not, or have it imposed upon me, or whether the credit system, which is obviously very important, is destroying debtors through creditors. I've monocausally left out, like Marx did in Volume 1. So I'm concentrating on what's happening to surplus value in relation to capital's expansion and accumulation and the impact of the labour movement. I'm linking these two things together in a one-to-one, clearly mechanical way. So you can see the sharp rise in strikes in the period towards the end of the 19th century in UK labour movement. This is the period of the new unions, when Eleanor Marx worked with a number of the unions, gas workers and others. There was major development of unions, and a major development of strikes in this period. This is a period after the end of the Great Long Depression, which is just a bit before here, where there was a recovery period. And we saw the labour movement recovering, workers gaining, we saw earlier, increases in real wages, leading to the position where they had strength, and yet the capitalism was still struggling with a difficult period of, and they were unable, they had to make concessions in this period, and these strikes did lead to concessions, but also after this period, when there was rising profitability, they were able to make those concessions, and the strike levels, in my opinion, dropped away throughout the 1900s, right through to the near the end of 1910, when again we had a new development. The profitability had been falling. I could show the graph come together. Capitalism is finding more difficult to make concessions. The unions were extremely strong at this point, at least in relative standards they'd ever been before, and we had these major struggles just before the First World War in the UK labour movement. Here's the interwar period. We see that these struggles immediately after the end of the First World War continued, strong unions, but falling profitability. This is my combination for the real moment of class struggle. Strong unions, falling profitability. That's when you get really intense class struggle. Doesn't happen all the time, that combination. We see that up to the period 1920-22, the railway strike, and of course the general strike, which brings the collapse of the trade union movement in the UK. What happens after 1926? There's rising profitability, the unions are crushed, there are no strikes. There's no class struggle, whether it's within the organizations of the labour movement and within the companies and across the board. Here's the post-war period. We have high profitability now and a recovering labour movement in the 50s. The strike rate begins to pick up. But look at that. It's back to those great old days in the 70s where profitability is, as we saw, dramatically falling. There is a very strong union movement which is still existing in the UK. We have major struggles. Series of major struggles are in this period in the late 1970s, the early 1980s, and eventually with the defeat of the miners' strike in 1985, the collapse of the unions, as we saw in the 20s. Profitability in the neoliberal period now rises to some extent. The unions are weak. What's happened to the strike record in the UK since the late 1980s to now? Virtually zero. There is no class struggle in the production process as a result. So I try to link these things together and argue that, in effect, capitalism or capital has the barrier of profitability. The movement of profitability will also get a reaction from the labour movement depending on how strong it is. And in that position, the only way capitalism will go on if it can carry through the devaluation and destruction, the slaughter of capital and capital values and raise profitability. If the workers do nothing about it, then capitalism continues onwards. Now, I say waiting for Godot. I just want to present you a few alternative views about crises and what to do about them. The mainstream says that monetary management and regulate the economy, but sparingly, will solve all these problems. Well, that's obviously proven wrong, and even with monetary management we've had since 2008, we still haven't seen a recovery in the capitalist economy to where it was before. The Keynesian view is that we manage demand, government spending, easy money, even wage rises, although I've yet to hear any Keynesian economist who's ever advocated increased wage rises until recently, and to regulate finance. Well, again, I don't think that this long depression we've been in now, where those policies have been adopted, and the arguments of some of the Keynesians be that we haven't had government spending, have delivered. The post-Keynesian view is that we've got too much inequality. What we need is progressive taxation, a wealth tax, regulate and control finance. That raises the question of whether capitalism is in control of its economy or not. And it poses perhaps a conflict which leads to the point of view about why you need capitalist process of production at all, if that's the policy that we're going to advocate. The Marxist solution is to replace the capitalist mode of production. Now, when I spoke at the American Association of Economists in 2016, just to give you a brief account, this conference takes place every year in January in the US. There are about 12,000 graduate students and lecturers from all over America, mostly looking for jobs, because there's a job market going on behind it, but also going through hundreds and hundreds of seminars like this and speakers. And at the main meetings, you have Stiglitz and Krugman and Larry Summers, and they're speaking to 2,000 people, mainly students and PhD. But also, the Union of Radical Political Economy has its own seminars. And in there, we have the 20 people that have come along, and then we apparently never agree, even amongst us, on anything. But it's very kind of them, but the American Association agrees that there should be a joint meeting between the Union of Radical Political Economy people and the mainstream. Just one meeting every year. This meeting I was present at with other Marxist economists, and we all made wonderful contributions like this. And then Brad DeLong, who is a well-known Keynesian economist in University of Berkeley, California, was, as it were, doing Ben Fine's job this morning. He was the discussant. He got up and he said nothing about any of our papers, which seems to happen to mine. Anyway, he got up, said nothing, and what he did say was, look, the trouble with you Marxists is that you're waiting for Godot. You're just waiting for the capitalism to crash, and then the workers will take over. You're just waiting for this profitability or realization crisis, or whatever you want to call it, to bring capitalism down. And you're claiming there's absolutely nothing we can do about improving the lot of people at the moment. I don't agree, he said. We can do things now. We can increase government spending. We can have an infrastructure program. We can help the unions get better wages. We can have better and easier monetary policy. There's lots of things we can do while you Marxists are sitting around waiting for Godot, waiting for capitalism to collapse. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Reform or revolution? The class struggle, said Marx to Engels in a letter, as a finale which has found the solution of the whole smear. From a struggle over wages, hours, and working conditions or relief, it becomes, even as it fights for those things, a struggle for the overthrow of the capitalist system of production, a struggle for proletarian revolution. Many of the so-called reforms that Brad DeLong were advertising, pushing forward, now, at this current moment, with such low levels of profitability amongst many of the capitalist economies, is actually posing the question of going beyond just relief, just better wages, but also a struggle for the overthrow of the capitalist system of production, in which case that should become the main point that comes out of Capital's Volume 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll take a round of questions as earlier. I'll try to get maybe 5 or 6 at a time. And I'm quite mindful that we've overrun a little bit. So if you could keep your questions quite brief, that would be fantastic. And also encourage some women again to participate. That would be great. Maybe there in the back, I saw 2 hands raising first. Yes, madam?
No,
maybe first and then...
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, were you going to go? Do you want...
You can go first, and then should we leave the lady first, and then yourself? Oh, thank you.
Yes. No, just quickly. Thanks very much. I really just have. I think it will take off on the rate of profit again, probably. But I really have a question to David Harvey. A lot of things I think are fantastic in his talk, the way he takes it through and maps capital, the questions on value, and so on. But 2 things struck me about it. One of them is, I think, the analysis about the growth of the countries in the Chinese orbit, if you like. And I think if we take a look at Latin America, I mean, we can actually see that is very short-lived. Brazil, a case in point, the growth kind of has come to an end, which is why partly we are seeing the reaction that we are seeing, the political reaction. Similarly in Argentina, I mean, the current government thinks he's one of the capitalist champs and whatever, and in on the club, and he struggles to get to the kind of investment that he wants. All sorts of things. So the growth within the Chinese orbit actually has sort of kind of stopped or slowed, certainly. That's one thing. The other thing, what surprised me a little bit, is that David seems to draw sharp dichotomy between class struggle and anti-capitalist struggles. And I think that is problematic for the left. And I think we actually do need to discuss this. I don't think class struggle is just, in Marxist terms, the struggle against capitalism. I think it's the struggle between classes. And I think, if you take, for example, you might have heard of Maldonado, who disappeared a couple of months ago by the military in Argentina. There were massive mobilizations. There continue to be massive mobilizations about it. This was Maldonado, who was a street vendor, who was supporting the Mapuche cause against none less than Benetton, and disappeared during a repression. Now, is this an anti-capitalist struggle or class struggle? Well, to be honest, it is both. And I think it would be more helpful to perhaps envisage the capital, because it is about who owns the means of the land rights, who owns the means of profitability and so on, even in terms of land, in terms of resources and what have you. So I think it is very much part of the class struggle, and it is perhaps significant to understand anti-capitalist struggle as an expression of the class struggle today, and which is actually quite significant in itself. So if you want to come back to that would be great.
Here we have first,
Yeah, cheers, Pete Green. Two issues amongst many that could be raised. One is the question of cyclicity in the system. I think it was Trotsky back in the early 1920s has a famous quote about the system, or, as long as it survives, as long as it lives, it will continue to breathe in and out. It's just the character of the breathing will change. There are periods when the breathing is weak, stutters and so forth, and other periods when the breathing is much healthier. What's missing, I think, actually from both accounts today was actually there was relatively little attention, I think David Harvey rather more than Michael, to the question of cyclicity. And I think it's easy, especially when we live in Britain and we're conscious of how it seems like this crisis with austerity and so forth has gone on and on and on. In reality, if we look globally, there was a cyclical recovery. It was a weak recovery. It was a recovery characterised, certainly in the core economies, by virtually zero growth in real wages, or worse than that. But it was a recovery, as David Harvey quite rightly said, which if you look at places like China and so forth, was actually very significant. And the system continues to breathe and it continues to expand. The second question is what's distinctive about the crisis that did break out in 2007, 2008, and this is where I think Michael Roberts fails signally to actually live up to something he himself will acknowledge, but then sort of somehow it all gets lost in the picture, that we had a crisis that didn't begin in the productive sector, it began in the housing sector and the property sector. It began in other words, in a way that reflected that peculiar combination of financialization, the growth of the credit system, and a particular crisis that nobody really expected within the Marxist brigades in that housing sector, which remains absolutely critical to making any sense of what's been happening in a whole number of countries, Ireland, Spain, and so on. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. We have two, I saw two hands there in the side, yes, over there. The man, and I think there was someone, and then we can come. Oh.
Shall I try and be a bit quieter? I just wanted to ask direct a question to David Harvey with regard to equilibrium, because you say Marx makes an assumption about equilibrium in different ways through all three values of capital. I don't think that assumption, either the phrase, I mean, you know capital a lot better than I do, but I don't think either the phrase or the concept is there. In fact, in the chapter on the commodity right at the start, he says direct commodity circulation in and of itself has the roots of crisis within it and a realization crisis that's overcome by money. And he's taken that potentiality for crisis ever more ever more concretely. And I think it's put well by another Paul Matic. I mean, two political economists called Paul Matic. What are the chances on that? Maybe they're related. When he said that capitalism isn't in any way an economy of equilibrium, it's at every level continual disequilibrium. It's a dynamic disequilibrium. In fact, if you're running a firm, whether you're selling bottles of green gauge jam at the local village fete, or you're trying to sell Windows 10 or whatever we're not on at the moment, you go to market, you never know whether you're going to sell your commodities, whatever they are. There's a constant level of disequilibrium. There's a constant realization problem within capitalism, which is like background noise for every single commodity seller within the market. I think the point that with Marx is that it's hard to see within that how that becomes the potential for individual episodic crises become general crises, whereas with the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, there's something that's systemic as a whole that allows these sort of events that we've seen in 2007, 2008, whatever, to take place throughout the system as a whole. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. I'll take two questions that I saw there, and then two questions here in the front by Alex. And
Oh, thank you. David Harvey gave a tour de force presentation. It was worth travelling a long way to come to that. And I would say one of its qualities was that it was mesmerising. I want to try and ask a few questions about it, though, because if you remember the very first two images, there is something very fundamentally different between the hydrological system and the circuits of capital that he showed. The fundamental fact about the hydrological circuit is that there is a conservation of the total quantity of water. Apart from marginal additions and subtractions because of chemical processes, the same total quantity of water just circulates in different forms and etc., etc. Whereas, of course, the essence of the circuits of capital is that this is a self-expanding, the constantly increasing quantity of value being circulated. And, of course, apart from primitive accumulation, where capital encounters pre-capitalist forms and you have profit from alienation, the actual site of the generation of this extra value is the production process itself. And that is why it seems to me a little bit odd and questionable about how much can really be explained if we maintain, as do the bourgeois economists, the production process as a black box, as was done by David Harvey just now. And it's particularly important that we think about this because actually that production process has gone through an enormous transformation in the last 30, 40 years. The production process, or very, very large parts of it, the extraction of surplus value part, if you like, has been shifted from high-wage to low-wage countries. And as David Harvey pointed out, China helped to save and rescue capitalism with its massive stimulus package in 2007, 2008, and an even bigger one in 2015, as it happens, relatively and absolutely. But actually, the first time that China rescued capitalism from its crisis in the 1970s was when they offered up their labour to be super-exploited by Western transnational corporations, which set in motion vast... what we find, therefore, is that the production process has moved to China and Bangladesh and other countries, but if you actually look at the recipients of the revenues of this production process, they still largely remain in the imperialist countries. That's where still the majority of capital is concentrated. That is where the great wealth of the world is concentrated, and China is certainly starting to change that picture, but fundamentally it's the same. So in other words, it seems to me that by eliminating the production process, David Harvey is able to shift attention entirely onto the primitive accumulation, which he says is now the defining contradiction of capitalism, which seems to me to get it dead wrong, because really this defining contradiction of capitalism is not where capitalism meets pre-capitalist or non-capitalist economic forms, but is actually within the capital-labour relation itself, the extraction of surplus value. And that is what I would say would be a Marxist approach to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Now there's loads of hands. Maybe let's move a bit geographic. Let's go here to the front. Alex, I think you had a...
Okay, I mean, I think, David, that was a really brilliant bravura performance. I mean, to look at capitalism from the perspective of circulation, enormously suggestive, and I think, you know, that was absolutely great. But then, having done that, at the end of your presentation, David, you say, and we've all forgotten about China, and look at China. And here I agree very much with John Smith. The story of China, as David's own charts show, is a story of a huge new engine of capitalist production and its role in the world economy. So if we want to talk about China, we have to talk about production. Not production in isolation, the unity of production and circulation, all the things that Marx himself says, but China is a story of capitalist production. And this relates to the debate about the Marxist theory of crisis, because here I disagree with Michael Heinrich. I think Marx, in the draft of Capital Volume 3, has the sketch of a theory of crisis, which is to do with, on the one hand, the interaction between the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the counter tendencies, and the way in which that interaction is speeded up or slowed down by the cycle of financial bubble and bust. That's Marx's theory of crisis. He doesn't shift away from it. There's no evidence that he did. If you look at what he focuses on in the 1870s, it's things he's worried about. Volume 2, most of the manuscripts of Volume 2 come from the 1870s, and also trying to understand the new forms that finance are taking. That doesn't contradict this theory of crisis. But if we look at that theory of crisis, China is very, very important, because China, as John says, provides this great mass, or it's part of the story that John tells, very importantly, mass of cheap commodities, which helped to keep real wages down in the north, and China also generates massive demand for raw materials, luxury goods, etc., etc., etc. So China plays a very important role in helping capitalism to manage its crisis tendencies. There's one very interesting feature to this story that I'd be interested to see what David and Michael think about it, which is part of China's ability to do all this is that it doesn't have a stupid, financialized, Western-style financial system. Ultimately, the Chinese financial system is still controlled by the state, and I think that's critical to the ability of the Chinese ruling class to manage their problems and so on and so forth. So, to a significant extent, the global ruling class are dependent upon the management skills of the Chinese ruling class, and particularly Chinese central bankers. That's an interesting thought.
So thank you. There's a lot of questions and hands up. I'm going to prioritize first. There's a lady there in the middle. If you could raise your hand, and then I'll shift to the other side of the room again. If you questions brief, that'd be great.
It's both a question and a comment as well. I would add on what has been mentioned about China, because I'm happy that came about in this session, because it is very crucial to understand what's happening in China and its trajectory as well, because apart from the way it rises, the combination of planning and at the same time championing neoliberalism at the moment, from what it is stating, it is also very, very interesting to look at its movement in terms of investing even in Europe. I mean, last year alone, it has invested 35 billion in European countries. And the main destinations of those investments are Germany, the UK, and France. And the way that it's investing is also very, very targeted. It wanted technology. It wanted the brands to help its own economy. In terms of what David mentioned about the coupling of oil with the dollar, a very interesting development earlier this month at the BRICS meeting is that both China and Russia stated that they will now start to do a ruble and oil and renminbi and oil, and that will have a very dramatic impact in the global economy. So it will be very interesting to look at that development. My question also is that in the 1970s, when the US did that, we have a different political economy and environment. If now the Russian and the Chinese states will do that, what will be the impact and what's the difference with that? It is easy to imagine that it will have a significant impact, but what are the challenges they're facing, considering it's a different situation now? However, the rivalry between the old capital and the new capital is what could be probably something new. My last point is on the struggle inside China. It's very interesting also if people would learn more about the protests going on in China. They have stopped counting, but as late as 2008, the average is 20 protests per hour in China. And there's not much study about this. However, these protests are not national in scope because it's impossible. The way that the Chinese state manage its governance, it is very, very difficult for Chinese movements even to coalesce amongst themselves. Many people do not know their counterpart in other cities. So looking at the Chinese capital and looking at the struggle of Chinese people would be very, very crucial. Thank you.
We have one there and another here in the front, two more, and then I'll continue. No, it was the gentleman there, yeah.
Michael, next time you're in the States and these pesky Keynesians abuse you in the way you described, just say to them, why is it that the super rich are buying up New Zealand to build their safe houses to ride out the next economic storm? Because that's exactly what's happening at the moment. Now, Michael was quite right to describe the importance of the rate of profit, but the matter when it comes to capitalism is actually quite complex, and there is an issue of realization. And the best way to understand the two and reconcile them is to look at how the disease affects a human body. We have the chronic phase and we have the acute phase. The chronic phase broke out from about 1996 with the acceleration of globalization, because what you had was a huge growth in surplus value, which was centralized and concentrated in the United States in particular, but in Europe and Japan as well. And when you look at the graph, the cash flow of the major corporations, whether they're United States or Japan or German or whatever, you see corporate cash flow, which is depreciation plus profits, versus investment. And this is the two arms opening up. The arm which is the potential for socialism, the arm which is the depressed state of investment, which is the necessity for socialism. And that gap is huge liquidity growing in the industrial corporations. So Marx's point about the fact that the surplus of society under a capitalist society is owned by the capitalist class and they won't spend all of it is a true one. It's absolutely true. There has been a chronic condition of depressed demand. But within that chronic condition, you get the acute phases. And the acute phase is the one that kills the patient, not the chronic phase. The chronic phase can weaken and age the patient. But it's the acute phase which kills the patient. And that acute phase can only be understood in terms of the rate of profit. So I'll finish off with one final point. The
the industrial gap between China and the United States today is equivalent to the gap that existed between North American industrial capacity and Japanese industrial capacity at the time of Pearl Harbor.
Thank you. So we'll take one more question here in the front and give an opportunity to the speakers to come back to some of these points, and hopefully we might be able to have some bit more time.
The theme of this session was mapping the terrain for the anti-capitalist struggle. The presenters as well as the discussants discuss about surplus value, rate of profit, capitalism. It's important, true, but where is the anti-capitalist struggle? Michael Roberts finished his presentation with a slide giving a quote of Marx that the struggle for higher wages will go further until a struggle against capitalism. This is a nice hope, and I can share this hope, but when I look to the history of 20th century, this hope is several times in a very bloody way denied. Big parts of the working class, in some European countries at least, joined very right-wing, even fascist movements. Any automatism that the fight for higher wages will lead to a fight for socialism or communism is in the 20th century denied. And when we look around what happens nowadays, what happened in the year 2017, in France, the Front National had its best election results, I think something like 22–23%. And a big part of this Front National consists from the French working class. In Germany, we have next Sunday elections. A new right-wing party will rather strong enter parliament. And they are also backed by smaller parts of the working class. But a good part of the German working class also supports the Christ Democrats. So this hope Michael Roberts, or the quote he presented, is very nice, but I think it is denied very often. In the morning we spoke about checking categories empirically. When we apply this, then this assumption is denied. And now is my question to both presenters: how do you work with this? How do you react with this? In Michael Roberts' presentation, I must say I don't see really a possibility to tackle this problem. There is no space. There is only working class and profit rate, and what you presented at the end, when the working class is fighting, profit rate goes down and the capitalism comes in crisis. You can have examples for this. This is not wrong, but I think to understand history of 20th century, this is much too poor. David Harvey, in my view, gave us a more sophisticated, more open framework to discuss this, but I didn't see that you really discussed such problems. You just gave this framework, and then I think you changed the level of argumentation. You observed China, which indeed is very important for the development of world capitalism, but what is the connection to the theme as which the session was announced, the anti-capitalist struggles?
Thank you. Well, time constraints means unfortunately we were unable to take more questions, but the sort of level of engagement really shows us how rich both of these presentations were. And so I would like to sort of have a bit of time for both speakers to come back and discuss perhaps some, at least, of the points that were raised in the discussion. Who would like to go first?
I think definitely David should finish off. Let me just say something about China, which David raised in his graphs the huge increase in cement and other commodities that China has been sucking up from around the world and building roads, rail, and other infrastructure. 1.5 billion people with an economic growth of 6 to 10% over the last few years. I'm not surprised that the cement levels are much higher than they are in the US. 5 times the population and 5 times the growth rate over the last 10 years. That's a powerful fact for driving up the expansion in these areas. Why has China been able to do this? Well, in my view, they've been able to do this because, as Alex mentioned, they have control completely of the credit system through the state ownership of the banks, but not just the banks. The state-owned enterprises are a dominant part of Chinese economy. Now, I hear lots of people telling me, oh, SOEs, as they call them, because I have to listen to this every day when I'm doing my job for Mammon. The SOEs are now tiny. Capitalism is taken over. There's billionaires all over China, and actually the foreign investors are now in control. This is not true. State-owned enterprises still dominate the stock market. Most of the things you can invest in the Chinese stock market are actually state-owned enterprises. And those that are not fully state-owned are only partially privatized. So that the position of control of the whole of industry, not just the banks, is in the hands of the Communist Party and the state machine. And they're able to organize the plan, such as it is, as they see fit, in order to develop the Chinese economy. They're not doing this to save the rest of the world. They're doing it to develop the Chinese economy and maintain their political position. And if any billionaire steps out of line, then he finds himself disappearing for a few weeks until he's politically educated into what he's supposed to be doing. Democracy does not rule in China, but the plan of the Communist Party and the state does rule, and it also reduces the ability of the law of value and foreign capital to play a significant and decisive role in disrupting the Chinese economy. And thus we see the growth that we've seen. But it has not saved the rest of the capitalist economy. I disagree. China grew during the 2007-8 crisis and continued to operate an expansion there and didn't allow the massive drop in its trade because of the rest of the world going down to disrupt its economy. But it did not restore capitalist growth in the rest of the world. The rest of the world is still growing at only around, the major economies anyway, only around 2% a year, much lower than the average growth rate that we saw before the crisis. We're in a depression as far as capitalism is concerned in the so-called West or in the major capitalist economies. China stands out as an example against that, but not an ability to turn it round, in my view. And in that position, we have to remember, then, that what matters, as far as I'm concerned about where capitalism is going, is what is happening in the major capitalist economies of the United States, Europe, and Japan. Are they able to restore a sufficient level of profitability to drive capital accumulation forward? As far as I can see on the data, so far they have failed to do so, despite monetary easing, despite some fiscal expansion, despite Brad DeLong's policies. None of that has succeeded in turning around the major capitalist economies and get them out of this depressionary environment, which Guillermo Cargadi presented in a lot of evidence this morning in the flash graphs that I showed you. So I think the question of what's happening to profitability and profit is key to what is going to happen to the health of the capitalist economy. I think that's where the class struggle also is centered. I don't believe it's centered in the buyers and sellers battle over whether they like an iPhone or not, or whether they're being priced too much for drugs. These are what capitalists do. They cheat. They try to gouge higher prices. They try to fool consumers into buying crap, and they succeed often the case. But that's not the decisive class struggle, it seems to me, nor is it decisive whether the banks have lent too much money to a load of debtors, whether it's Greek government or individuals, and that will lead to where the struggle, the class struggle, the anti-capitalist struggle would take place. No, I still believe that if we're going to have any major struggle that works, it's going to come between the working class, the creators and producers of value and surplus value, and the owners of capital who stand in the way of the needs of the population. That is where we have to look. The working class, internationally now, even if you define it just narrowly as industrial workers, which is not a correct Marxist definition, is never been bigger. It's huge. And it's not just, as I think Raquel said this afternoon, not just the question of it's massive in the so-called South or Third World, that it's grown through the industrialization and globalization. Also, in the major economies, it remains the dominant weighty force for change if it comes. Now, Michael Heinrich says, well, Michael Roberts' graph shows nothing's happening, so it's all over. Well, there's a certain truth in that. We can see the strike rate, at least in the UK, is virtually zero. Profitability is low. The working class organizations in the unions are weak. The ability to struggle has been weak. The days of the 70s are well gone. The neoliberal period has created a different environment. I tried to show the history of that profitability in relation to the labor movement to show that there's not impermanent, intense class struggle all the time. It's that the situation, the balance of forces between capital and labor varies depending on the health of capital, whether it needs to drive down workers' position and conditions because its profitability is falling, or whether it can make concessions, whether it is possible for labor movements to recover and grow in strength or not. These are periods over generations that can often create new situations. Revolutions don't happen very often. I noticed that. In fact, I think it's 100 years since the last one that we could talk about changing the capitalist mode of production. They don't happen very often. But, okay, well, there's another small one that's hopefully going to survive. But the point I would make is that they don't happen very often, but when they do, they make a huge impact on the whole development of the class struggle. And those class struggles have always been in the course of the industrial proletariat leading it, with the rest of other classes and the sections of society, behind the struggle to overcome and defeat capital. And that seems to me where we should be continuing to look and map out the class struggle.
Yeah, I could answer some of the detailed questions, but it seems to me that maybe that doesn't make sense. Some people were attributing views to me I didn't say, so I don't want to get into kind of saying, I didn't say that, blah, blah, blah. Well, I feel like it, but I'll leave that at one side. I think that I make one general observation. What I tried to say, in case you didn't get it, was that we have to think about capital as a totality. And that the totality is made of relations between production, realization, distribution, reinvestment, and that they are all vital to each other. And one of the things you get from the beginning of Volume 2 is a notion that they are all codependent upon each other. And now, when I talk about these things, I often talk about the realization and the distribution side of things because they're not very well understood in relationship to Volume 1. And because I don't spend all my time elaborating on, the nature of class and the labor process in Volume 1, blah, 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 everybody comes back at me and says, you're ignoring production, and we've got to talk about production and production and production and production. And yes, of course we do. And of course the labor struggles and all the rest of it is significant. But on the other hand, you're not listening to the other parts of what I'm talking about. You're somehow or other saying, oh, well, if we don't get back to production, I've lost the ground upon which my particular understanding of Marx stands. And you've got to get rid of that. You've really got to get rid of that and understand the totality of what he was trying to do, and to start to see in which there are relational dialectical configurations of his thinking between production, realization, distribution, and reinvestment. It is not, in Marx's case, a cycle, and I said this very clearly, it's not a cycle, it's a spiral. And it's a spiral because it's all about accumulation. And then to be told that somehow or other I'm going into the kind of blah, blah, you didn't understand me. But get it, no, I've done it now. But the point I'm making here is that it's very important that we do understand standard remarks. Now, I have great sympathy with Michael's question. I mean, I'd love to get to all of this, and there was an issue which I began to articulate, which I think we haven't debated or discussed. I didn't draw a sharp distinction between anti-capitalist and class struggles. I asked the question, when is a class struggle actually, when does it encompass the Mapuche demanding their land rights in southern Chile or Argentina or wherever? Is that form of class struggle part of what we are thinking about? And if it's not, why are those struggles so important? And why is it that the indigenous populations often get shoved aside by socialist programs, as they have been done in Ecuador and so on, mainly because Ecuador borrowed a lot of money from China, and then the Ecuadorian government in return had to give the Chinese free access to their mineral resources, which, by the way, boomed Ecuador a little bit in the process. And then in the process, of course, the Ecuadorian government had to clear out the indigenous population that got in the way. And so indigenous people are turning up dead in ditches and so on, and this is the government's doing. This is not, I mean, so how do we think about all of these sorts of processes? And then I ask the other questions. Look at some of the major struggles that have occurred around the world over the last 15 years and look at their character. Give you one, Gezi Park. Was this a working class struggle in the classic sense? What was it? It was an uprising. And what was it about? It was about lack of democracy in urban life, and it was about the qualities of urban life. Who were the people doing it? It wasn't, all the cloth cap people and, and all the people waving red flags. They were there, but they came in a bit later. What about Brazil in 2013 when in 100 cities, thousands of people, millions of people are on the streets? What are they fighting about? They're saying, we don't like all the way in which this money is being spent on stadiums and things like that. We need it for other things. And by the way, that transport increase is a real problem. And we're going to go after that. There's a huge struggle there. And do we then say, oh, this is a class struggle? Okay, I'm fine with that. But then you've got to redefine a little bit what class struggle is about. It's not just about what's going on in production. It's about daily life. And in fact, a lot of the struggles which are going on in the world right now are about the qualities of daily life. There is mass alienation in the world, and one of the things we're seeing with all the voting patterns is an incredible onset of mass alienation. People alienated from their work, alienated from politics, alienated from the qualities of their daily life, alienated from nature. I mean, alienation is a huge, huge problem. And it seems to me that the left has to kind of start to think about that. And when I start talking about that, I don't want somebody to come and give me a lecture about somehow or other I'm neglecting production, because I'm not. But at the same time, you've got to think about all these other struggles and how they fit. And the struggles that go on in urban life against, for example, the foreclosures, against gentrification. What kind of struggles are those? And are they part of our mission as a left organization? And my answer is yes. For me, they clearly are. And actually, if you look back and you say, what was the Paris Commune? What was it about? Was it simply, working class in a classic sense? No, the two first things that were passed in the Paris Commune, one was suspension of night work in the bakery, which is a labor kind of production kind of thing. The other is the moratorium on rent payments. And boy, wouldn't moratorium on rent payments in London right now be an incredible thing? And you kind of go, but that when you go to the whole kind of thing I'm talking about, that fits in what I'm talking about, but it fits in a different kind of area, and it's a struggle, for instance, over gentrification and buy to let and all that kind of stuff. All of that is somehow or other very much part of what I would want to call an anti-capitalist politics. And it has to be actually foundational for what we do in exactly the same way that struggles at the point of production are foundational to what we do. So I think you should do another graph. Yeah. And that would be the number of struggles there are against gentrification. Okay? You do that graph, and what you'll see is that actually there's a massive amount of activity going on. And actually, this is actually where a lot of socialism can be built from. In other words, this is, no. I think that, so to me, I think this whole kind of question of exactly how we define what class struggle is about. And of course, there is a whole kind of set of problems as to how working populations have been disaggregated and all that sort of thing and so on. For me, one thing that's very clear right now is we know who the fuck the bourgeoisie is. We know who they are. We can put faces on them. And we know who we've got to get out of the way. We know who we're fighting. And we're going to have to fight them with different reasons. Some because of an alienated relation to nature. Some because you're being foreclosed and evicted from your housing. Some because they're having a terrible time in the workplace. And everybody, there have to be alliances built across that whole map that I was putting up there. So part of the role of that map for me was to kind of try to say something about the nature of the struggles. And some of these struggles are actually coming on board in a very, very interesting kind of way. For instance, the whole thing that I put in the corner there, the point of species being and the way in which the gifts of human nature are brought into the picture. One of the things that the election of Trump has done has had a lot of people in the United States saying, what does it really mean to be an American? And some people are even saying, what does it really mean to be a human being? This guy is inhuman. I don't want to be like that. But he's the role model right now. Are we going to have a whole generation of people who come and actually behave like Trump? Is this the model of humanity that we've... I mean, Marx's point about a species being is it's being created and recreated all of the time. And actually, we're seeing the creation and recreation of a species being in a very ugly way. And this goes back, of course, also to one of the things you were saying about the fascism and so on, and Hungary, and what's been going on. And I think that actually all of that is part and parcel of what the politics has to be. And it can get mushy, kind of moralistic and all the rest of it. But probably we need some of that right now. Because these are bigger questions, and they integrate into the totality. And I think the reason that map for me is so important is precisely to think about the different spaces and ways in which struggles can actually be articulated. And if I had a kind of utopian fantasy, it would go something like this. I'd say, oh, okay, we should have a brigade which is given over to actually the correction of our alienated relation to nature. And we should have a brigade that is actually dedicated to the question of the improvement of daily life for the mass of the population. We should have a brigade dealing with questions of the production. We should have a brigade dealing with, okay, what kind of human beings do we want to create? And in other words, we got to have a lot of this going on. And actually, a lot of this is going on right now in various places, in various ways. So I'm not pessimistic in the sense of saying, there's nothing going on, just because, the strikes are flatlined in Britain right now. Yeah, they are. But, there are many other forms of struggle which are actually being articulated and which I think are very foundational for the transition from the kind of raw capitalist, ugly society in which we're living to a much more humane, decent, socialist, eventually communist society. Those are the things we need to do. And we need indeed to discuss in much greater detail how we articulate and bring all of these struggles together. And we didn't do that, and I wanted to pose that question, and I didn't do that, and I'm sorry, Michael, I didn't do it. Next time, I'll do it all the time. Thank you.
Yes, I think so. Just to announce that's the end, but tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock for the first panel of the second day of the conference. Thank you very much